So PIVOT-02 has a dose escalation, phase 1B, and then phase 2. Earlier this year at ASCO, we described and we completed the dose escalation as well as preliminary efficacy and safety data of the phase 2 as well. And by completion the dose escalation of the PIVOT-02, we identified the recommended phase 2 of NECTAR-214 as 6 microgram per kilogram, giving concurrently with nivolumab at 360 milligram flat dose every 3 weeks. And now we in SITC we reported the complete safety, efficacy, and biomarker data of the completely enrolled a cohort of first-line melanoma in the combination treated with the combination NECTAR-214 and nivolumab. The baseline patients demographics of the PIVOT-02 for the melanoma cohorts were enrolling a lot of the similar to what we see in the phase 2 pivotal trials like the Checkmate 067 and Keynote 006 in terms of a percentage of patients who have elevated LDH. Usually that's above 30%, and that's what we have in the PIVOT-02. A substantial percentage of the patients have also M1C, means patients who have visceral involvement, more than just lung or subcutaneous. And we also have about 37% of the patients who have PD-L1 negative, with most of the patients' PD-L1 status are known. However, I think 10% or less they have unknown status of their PD-L1. But in general, these are patients' demographics that similar to what you see in phase 3 trials, and that's what you want to capture in single-arm phase 2 trials, that how much the patient's demographic resemble phase 3 pivotal trials. In terms of efficacy, we have seen that the overall response rate as determined by independent radiology review was 53%, with 24% achieving complete response and disease control rate of 76% response rate, which is very encouraging. When you look at the responses, you can see that patients who have PD-L1 negative at their baseline in the tumor have also achieved deep responses, as well as patients who have PD-L1 positive. What's also encouraging from the data that we've seen some meaningful responses in patients who have what we call them negative clinical prognostic factors, such as patients who have elevated LDH and patients who have liver metastasis. And we've seen responses in 45% and 50% respectively. We also seen some deep responses going over times. The responses seen early with a median time to response was 2 months. A lot of the responses are durable, and 85% of the patients who are responding continue to be on the study responses. Median duration of response has not been reached at the time of the presentation at SITC. We have seen overall responses obtained and assessed by the independent radiology review of 53% response rate. Among those, 24% achieve complete response rate. We've seen many of the patients who had initially partial responses, their partial response continued to deepen and the target lesions continued to shrink. And some of those, at least my patients that I know that enrolled into the trials, have achieved a complete response, started at partial response. So we definitely see continuous immune response. While we see that in single agents nivolumab, it was really noticed also in this trial with the combination of NECTAR-214. And this kind of deepening of responses can sometimes be explained with the mechanism of action of NECTAR-214. The most common treatment-related adverse events in this trial were flu-like symptoms. About 70 and above 70% of the patients developed flu-like symptoms, which translate into fatigue, pruritus, and rash. But most of these patients have, most of these toxicities were grade 1 and 2. These toxicities usually are predictable. They occur 24 hours after the first administration of the drug, and they last usually 3 to 5 days. Generally, they're treated with conservative treatments as NSAIDs or over-the-counter and hydrations. frequency and the intensity of these symptoms were decreasing. We noticed that they are decreasing over time after the first dose. Some of that is physiological adaptation of the body to these toxicities, and some of it psychological adaptation, where the patient is really embracing themselves and know what they're expecting. The positive side of, if we can say anything positive about toxicity, is the predictability of these toxicities. We know when they're going to start, and we know roughly when they're going to end, and that gives assurance to the patients, but to the physicians, and to prepare patients how to be treated. And if these symptoms linger more than the expected time, then we know that the patients will notify us and maybe something different is going, which allow us very quickly to interfere and monitor the patients more closely. About 5% of the patients had immune-mediated adverse events requiring immune suppressive treatment. Two patients had treatment-related discontinuation of the treatment trials.